Welcome back to another episode of Science of the Strike, a podcast that is dedicated to taking a more scientific, analytical approach to the sport of bass fishing. My name is Corbin Healy, and I am joined, as always, with my co-host, Sam Huckabee. And we are incredibly excited to finally, bring you episode 13.
Woo!
We're excited. We do have to admit we feel bad, as we always say. Sam and I are new professionals. We both just recently started new jobs, and so we are getting absolutely eaten alive at work right now. And so we're not posting as much as we once were, or certainly not as much as we would like to. But we want to say thank you to our supporters. We've, in this, kind of the last, 3-4 weeks that we haven't been posting as much, we've gotten a lot of support, people asking if we're okay, people making sure that we're still going to be putting stuff out. And we appreciate you guys. We absolutely are. And we're going to continue to keep putting stuff out as much as we can. But again, we just want to remind everyone that, we're doing this as a secondary thing because we love it so much. And so, as always, just a little plug for us as where to find us. You can listen to us on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok, and all the places you find podcasts. We have been kind of soft launching some exciting updates in past episodes, and finally we're going to disclose all of that. We're very excited. The first, you can probably, if you're watching, you can probably see the first, which is what Sam's got all over. He's even got it on his walls right now. We have finally our first kind of prototype run of merch. So you can see he's got the hoodie there. He's got the hat. We've also got the shirt. And Sam, why don't you show him the back? So same deal. And that's also on the back of the hoodie. We're trying to figure out what colors we like, if we like, this material. So far, we've really enjoyed the material, but we want to keep putting the hat to use to make sure that it, keeps together well. If this is something, these things that you have feelings about, look at the hat, look at the, hop on YouTube, check everything out. If you like it, let us know. If you don't like it, let us know, because depending on what you guys give us feedback on, we're going to probably make some more and make it available to you guys. If you're someone who's listening, who supports us and or wants to support us, hit us up on any of the social medias or anything like that, and we will get you hooked up with some merch. Even more exciting, in our opinion, as we disclosed in our last episode, episode 12, I believe, Sam and I went ahead and made Science of the Strike a formal LLC in the state of Missouri, because we have some really great partnership opportunities, one of which we are excited to disclose to you guys tonight. We are creating a partnership with Outcast Tackle. The guys at Outcast Tackle, specifically Lee, reached out to us. He saw what we were doing, and Outcast is always trying to take an angle that will be best for the angler, be best for the guys who are not only spending a lot of time on the water, but the guys who care about the nitty-gritty stuff like we do. Yeah. If you have listened to any of the podcasts, you know that we get really down into the details, and so do they. And so we have already started working with them on prototypes for a jig. And what we're wanting to do is to create a jig that tries to highlight and employ as many of these scientific topics that we've talked about. Yeah. Sight, sound, hydrodynamics, the whole 9 yards. And so scent, the whole 9 yards. And so this is going to be a long, deal. We anticipate that we're going to be working on this for well over a year with them. And so the biggest thing we want to tell you guys is we want you all to be involved. We want this to be a kind of community experience where our listeners are giving us feedback about, or thoughts about, hey, maybe you do this, maybe you try this. We've had success here, we've had success there. You guys are already giving us ideas as it relates to our episodes. Now, together, we want to work with you all to create a jig that we all feel excited about, but also employs these techniques and factors to where we go on the water, we can say, hey, this jig is scientifically proven to have those things that might promote catching more fish. So huge shout out to Outcast Tackle. We're super excited to be working with them. You'll be hearing lots more from us in the future as we start getting prototypes and working on things like that. We'll be sure to update everybody on that. All right, finally to the topic that we are getting in tonight with episode 13. We are doing a continuation of our Prey series. So if you are new to the podcast, we have our big overarching, big ticket items that we've been talking about with the scientific implications to the sport. But we also have been doing a little kind of I don't know what you'd call it, subcategory or subchapter that we've been weaving in and out of prey species. Because in our opinion, to understand the predator, you have to absolutely understand the prey. So we've done episodes on bluegill, crawfish, shad, and today we are bringing you an episode on crappie. We think that crappie are one of the most highly underrated species of prey that bass are regularly foraging on, and that they're really readily available in most of our lakes. So we, as always, Sam is going to kick us off getting into the seasonal patterns, the biology, the anatomy, the ecology of what makes a crappie tick. And then after he's done doing that, I'm going to take it over a little bit and talk about the interaction between largemouth bass and crappie and the implications that that interaction has to angling and how we can be better on the water, understanding everything about crappie. So, Sam, unless I missed anything, take it away with crappie. That's a long one, and catch my breath.
Well, I just want to start off with saying we chose to do crappie today as our next episode because you guys have been commenting about it so often in the comments. You're like, I'm a crappie angler. How can we tie in, this to bass fishing? And someone just the other day, like, what are the caloric intake, factors for a crappie, because we talked about that with all the other stuff. So we thought this would be the time to do it, and crappie, just like bass, are in most of the lakes together. They cohabitate often, so it's a very important subspecies of prey to make sure we really understand and know better to make us better anglers. So to start, there's two kinds of crappie in majority of our lakes here in the United States, and that is black and white crappie. Okay, for beginners, like where do each of these inhabitate more than the other? So black crappie, for example, they're going to inhabitate more of the clear water, more of your highly dense vegetation water areas, whereas your white crappie are going to be in your more murky waters, more sandy bottoms, muddy bottoms, things like that, of that nature. So that kind of gives you an idea. You can picture your lake in your head that you're fishing most often and think about, which crappie population would probably do better in my lake.
Interesting.
You'd probably be able to guess if you don't already know, just based on that type of information I just gave you right there. But that's kind of where I want to start, just so you can kind of start to create these thoughts in your head as we're talking through this. Basic classification and morphology is where I want to start. How is their body structured? Okay, so they're very, very similar to the central archids, like bluegill and sunfish and things of that nature. Okay, so you're going to have that deep compressed body profile, very thin, where the growth and like height of the crappie can be almost as long as the width and as the length, and
big dinner plate.
Right. Exactly right. You're talking those pan sized crappie, just kind of like bluegill sometimes. So, in terms of size, black and white crappie can be very similar in size, but I will say white crappie tend to grow faster than black crappie. And that's going to be very important for our talk about forage for bass. So keep that in mind for later on, because even though black crappie hold the world record, coming, I think it's out of Tennessee, even for like the bigger crappie size.
Really?
Actually, yeah.
I would not have guessed that.
Right. No, I would not either. But I'm pretty sure it's black crappie that are actually just a little bit bigger than white crappie. Even though white crappie grow a little longer, black crappie actually get a little fatter and can weigh more. Now, length, I think white crappie can hold that record. But for pure weight, which is most of the times what people go by, it's the black crappie.
Wow.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting information right there. Let's talk about how crappie function as a caloric intake and caloric resource for any kind of bass or predator animal that's going to eat crappie. So like we talked about in our past episodes, how bluegill have a little higher caloric content than shad, and how crawfish have the same caloric content as bluegill almost. Crappie are even a higher caloric content than all of these combined. Well, not combined,
really?
but like more than bluegill or more than a crawfish. So with those sitting at like 75 calories per 85 grams or 85 calories per 85 grams, a crappie sits at 100 calories per 85 grams of fish. So very nutritional for this largemouth bass to take in a 3-ounce crappie, because that's what 85 grams is, 3 ounces. So, it's a very opportunistic meal for bass. And that's, super important to keep in mind, because we know how much bass are sight feeders and super opportunistic. So having something that can give them almost the highest amount of resources in one catch can be really important for them. So, how do crappie come to there's certain concentrations within a body of water is super important to understand too, because it talks about the health of the body of water in terms of how crappie can grow and if crappie can be a viable resource for bass. So
I've got some more on this too.
You got to have a little bit of a healthy concentration of crappie for this to happen. And the way that they measure this is by chlorophyll concentrations. And what chlorophyll concentrations come from is oftentimes the plants in the water or the grass or any kind of subspecies like that. So oftentimes where you have a grassier lake, or oftentimes, or, a very heavy tree population lake type of thing, the chlorophyll concentrations are going to be higher, and you have a better chance of having higher survival rates of crappie broods because of the zooplankton that the smaller crappie have to feed off of to survive through that age 0 to age 1 phase that they go through.
So let me make sure I'm following here, because that's pretty dense in my mind. So you're saying essentially that a lake that has higher chlorophyll concentration, the water, you mean, right?
Right, exactly.
Okay, the water that has a higher chlorophyll concentration, which really in turn means lakes that have higher vegetation levels.
Exactly right. Yeah, it's a better way
promote more zooplankton, which in turn promotes more accelerated growth for crappie, and specifically crappie, because of their foraging on zooplankton as small crappie. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly right.
Okay.
And that's super important to understand, because what we're going to talk about a little bit is like the extent to which bass can eat a size of crappie, right? We've talked about this in the past with bluegill and how they can get too tall, honestly, for the bass to be able to take in.
Episode 12, bite mechanics.
So exactly. Same thing kind of happens here. And that chlorophyll concentration, that availability of zooplankton is either going to move crappie out of that available resource for bass because they grow so fast, or can keep them in that phase longer and actually let them become more of a potential prey item for bass longer term.
Wow. Okay. I see.
So it's important for us, even though it might be hard to kind of wrap our head why I don't need to understand, vegetation levels in a body of water, but it can really play into why you may or may not want to pick up a crappie imitating bait.
Sure.
So that was pretty important for, what I could find, on, the importance of chlorophyll and like the crappie growth period over time. So super important there. So let's talk about, like I was kind of talking about, the gape limitation and body depth. So as we kind of talked about last time, bass will usually take in something that's, about 35% of their body length or less as they continue to grow. They become more of it's more of a strategy of risk avoidance. Like they don't want to get something stuck in their throat. They kind of can understand, what level they can take in. So I found this kind of interesting. It said, for a bass that's 100 millimeters in total length, which is very small, right? Like 3 inches or so, as they start to shift to eating, piscivorous fish type food, these they will consume prey around 35% of their body length, and then that gets lower and lower over time, but it stays somewhere around that 25 to 35% range is what I could find. So if you think a bass that you're going to weigh in a tournament that's 15 inches, right? If 35% of that is somewhere around 5 inches or so, you got to think that can play into a lot of how you might pick up a glide bait or something that's crappie patterned, right? That you start getting those real big crappie pattern baits, you might be hurting yourself because of the limitations that these bass are putting on themselves for risk avoidance and things of that nature. So I'm sure you're going to talk about that, a little bit, and how you can factor that into what you want to throw and stuff. But that's kind of the initial thought of like limitations for bass and how they're going to look at eating a crappie, right? Because it's just like anything else. They're thinking through all of these things to maximize their survival, right?
100%.
This is one of them.
And if you haven't listened already to episode 12, a lot of what Sam is talking about here, we go into a deep dive on episode 12 with bite mechanics, and also on our episode about bluegill. A lot of what he's talking about is all goes back to the gape of the mouth and the jaw and the direction that bass will inhale panfish like crappie or bluegill.
Yeah. So this is very generalized, but from what I could find, age 0 to age 1 cohorts for crappie in general, both subspecies, white and black, will somewhere be around like 5 inches at age 1. Okay, that's a healthy population. So
that's healthy.
So bass have 1 year of crappie brood, right, to eat on crappie. But then that lets you know, like that next spring, like that same brood is going to be up to, growing up to that 5-inch level.
Wow.
So what that kind of tells me is like crappie is always an available resource for largemouth bass in highly populated areas where crappie are, very common. So, once they get from age 1 to age 2, their usual length is they are about 7 to 8 inches long. So at age 2, those crappie can sometimes grow out of the possibility of, being eaten.
Sure.
So there's like a functional size refuge for these fish. Once they get to that level, like they're not prey anymore. They are predators at that point for majority of the fish in that lake.
Right.
Because crappie act very piscivorous, just like bass. They're just not the top predator in the lake. So, let's see what else I have here. So yeah, we kind of talked about how they, and this is one of the other things I want to talk about with the difference between white and black crappie. The white crappie are going to switch over to eating piscivorous or fish type diets much faster, somewhere around that 140 millimeter range, 100 to 140 millimeter range. So right after they get to 3 inches, they're off the zooplankton mainly, and they're focusing on fish forages much more often. So their growth spurt is going to be, much quicker to gaining that weight, putting on that length faster than, a lot of the black crappie, because the black crappie stay eating on zooplankton until they're about 200 millimeters, which is like double the size, right? Which can still be, and then they stay eating on that for considerably longer. Like I have the stats right here. It says, fish compromised of 64% volume by diet for white crappie once they were measuring over 200 millimeters. And then it said for, black crappie, they do not reliably convert to a fish-based diet at 200 millimeters yet, where they stay predominantly planktophagic. So
interesting.
It's very interesting how those two different crappie subspecies could play into what you may want to pick up, even if you have both of those in our lakes like we do in Missouri. You're going to have more of your whiter crappie down south, more of your black crappie up north. That's very common. But when you have both of them in your lakes, with those black crappies staying eating on that zooplankton longer, where they become almost into an energetic trap, is what this research paper, kind of stated, because they are eating basically maintenance levels, because they can only eat so much zooplankton, right, compared to what a fish will give you energetically. So And that, in my mind right there, that tells me why would I pick up a white crappie lure if there's going to usually be, black crappie that are maybe more likely to be around that size range longer.
Sure.
It's just something small, but could play a little more, as we go along talking about, energetic, availability and forage and all of these things that we learn how these crappie interact with each other in the same ecosystem, how they interact by themselves, as they're trying to just survive and grow. So
did you do any research about the time or water temperature that crappie prefer to spawn in?
Yeah. So what I could find was 62 degrees was their temperature range that they prefer to spawn in, but that could be anywhere from April to June is what I found.
Well, sure.
So, that's, a wide range, but once you find those early 60s, you're going to have those starting to push. And the way that it talked about them spawning is they get so shallow, like within 3 meters of the bank and usually in like inches of water. And I did not know that.
I did not know that either.
Right. I thought they spawned out maybe on trees because that's where they normally are. I feel like
I did too.
A lot of times, but yeah, they're pushing really shallow, and that's a lot of times when bass are taking most advantage of them, right? And that's why that bass, you think, oh, they're feeding up, before their spawn. That pre-spawn is so awesome all the time. This could be a big part of it. That we're not factoring in near as much as we should. Crappie have thermal tolerant constraints. So talking about the bodies of water that we're in is like they prefer to be in 34 degree water up to about 88, I think is what it was. Degree water.
That's warm.
Yeah, so that is pretty warm. But, getting really far south is if it gets super hot.
That's just their tolerance range.
Yeah, they can have a die-off of, potential crappie. But as they can get deeper down in the water, they can find those, more tolerable waters. So they are a very tolerant fish, and they survive in a lot of different weathers and frozen, Canadian lakes, things like that. So, last few things I wanted to talk about was movement and home range. So like I was saying, all the way down south to Texas, all the way up north into Canada. I've caught them both places. They span East Coast to West Coast. They've been introduced almost everywhere at this point in the continental U.S. and up into Canada. So very, very populated fish. What I found was they will move a lot more than I had initially thought. They did a telemetry study that looked at how far that these crappie will move throughout their seasonal migration, seasonal habitat movements. They will move from January to April, just in those 3 months, coming out of a little deeper water, coming up to more shallow water. We had some move over 8 miles.
Whoa.
Yeah.
That is huge.
You think you have a crappie tree out there. Those fish are not staying on that. Like they're moving.
Wow. Yeah.
And so that just kind of tells you like those fish are not trapped to a certain location, right? And have to be in a certain area.
Jeez.
There was some kind of results that came from this study as well that were also interesting to me, that at night, crappie typically locate deeper, 2.7 meters, to where compared to daytime depths, they're 1.8 meters. So they typically range, 3 to 4 feet shallower during the daytime than they would during the nighttime or
That's interesting. I would not have anticipated. I would have expected the opposite, maybe.
Right, because the light travels through the water.
Sure,
you would think they want to be able to push a little deeper, but that's not what this study found. So I found that a little bit kind of interesting, right? So, we talked about spawning a little bit. Talked about a little bit of forage. Yeah, I think that was a lot. I'm going to let you kind of talk about, trophic implications and them feeding on bass. But I will say this, for all of you bass fishermen on here that also fish for walleye, crappie and walleye are like the two most competitive fish for like the same prey. Like they can competitively inhibit each other like together more than a lot of the other fish in the lake, because they're constantly eating on those planktivorous, insectivorous diets and those really small bait fish. So high densities of crappie can often compete on common invertebrate resources and slow the growth rates of walleye. And they made that very, very clear in the research studies that I was looking at.
I would not have.
if you are being able to manage a lake or you're wanting your walleye population to look really well, take out crappie because that will help you. So yeah, I just thought that was a cool little tidbit that, I found, and I wanted to make sure that I know everyone listens to this because learning about bass is going to help you learn about other things.
Yeah,
too.
So, for sure.
Yeah, but that was a lot of my stuff. I feel like, that's a lot of background information on crappie to allow us to understand it a little better, and now kind of let you get to the point of, how are we going to use that? I've talked a little bit to it, maybe a little bit of coloration change you might choose, size you might be, accustomed to looking at or picking, and things of that nature can, just help you be a little better angler, just picking what you need to pick, comparatively to going too big or going too white, or not that white's ever going to be wrong, but if you're trying to imitate a crappie, it might help you to be a little darker. So
I'm going to do a little bit on color at the end. One thing before I kind of get into the implications that some of the stuff that I talked about and just have noticed just on the water that I think it is important for people to know. It might be so obvious that we don't say it out loud enough as it relates to kind of the ecology of crappie is their kind of preferred habitat. Crappie like to hold really tight to wooded areas, standing timber, pole timber, cypress tree, or not cedar trees, just different types of trees. Wooded areas are where you will see the highest population of crappie. I mean, shoot, you can go to a Bass Pro tank and observe that.
Sitting with their nose straight to the wood, like
exactly. So that in my mind, that in terms of implications for bass fishing, a place that you might consider if you're going to throw a crappie style lure is always going to, you're never going wrong throwing it around wood. One of my favorite ways to fish submerged trees is to drop that Sixth Sense crappie panorama down above or inside of those trees, and I've caught some really good fish doing that. The other thing that, again, I don't know if it really matters, but just so people know, is the way that crappie tend to sit when they will sit up on a piece of structure, whether it be a tall piece of grass or a piece of wood or something, is they tend to sit vertically, which is really odd. Again, you can observe this in a Bass Pro tank, but it's important because I think that when you're going over structures, say with your 2D sonar or even live scope, you can observe that. You can literally go over a spot and see fish stacked straight up like that. And usually, I mean, Sam and I have definitely done this and gone over a point and said, you know what, like, we're seeing marks, but the way that they're holding up, those are not bass. Just another way to be more efficient on the water. Seeing that vertical stack, you're not going to really ever see that out of bass. At least I haven't had a whole lot of experience seeing them just stationarily stacked up like that, whereas crappie will do that. Okay, so I wanted to kind of get into the implications of understanding crappie and also trying to be better at the sport of bass fishing. So I asked, I'm asked myself, what are the kind of primary questions that someone would want to answer? And the first is, how do largemouth bass and crappie interact? Just, I want to know how they do their thing. And I found two interesting studies. There are lots of studies about this, but the two that I thought were most interesting. The first is titled Competition Between Predator and Prey, Resource-Based Mechanisms and Implications for Stage-Structured Dynamics by a guy named Mark Olson in 1995. As always, if you're listening to this on Apple or Spotify, I always post the captions of the publishing and everything like that on YouTube, like in text or in the video. So fast forward to this point in the video and you will see a caption of where we're getting these studies. So what this study did, not only with crappie, but spent a lot of time, honestly, with bluegill, which overlap a lot as it relates to predator-prey relationship. This study talked a lot about what we discussed with our episode in bluegill is this competition phase.
Yeah.
How juvenile bass and panfish, like bluegill and crappie, compete at these very entry or early stages of life. Now, this is because largemouth bass, as Sam was kind of alluding at earlier, at a certain length class, have not yet developed a sufficient size to switch to that piscivorous diet. Right. And so that's when the two will really butt heads and overlap. And it's during that period that those juvenile bass are competing directly with juvenile crappie and other, with other blue panfish like bluegill for shared resources. Primarily, what Sam was saying is zooplankton and other aquatic invertebrates. And experimental studies that were done in this paper it reveal that resource competition exerted by these juvenile panfish significantly impair the growth rate of young largemouth bass. And so Sam said this earlier, and we've seen this time and time again about pond management with trying to get a healthy population of juvenile largemouth and a population of crappie. They oftentimes butt heads. Great, we've plugged in before, great resource. The aquatic biologist has talked about this as well, that at least in the context of ponds, so this is a very small context, but it does extrapolate over into lakes, is that too diverse of a juvenile base of fish can choke each other out. Moving from that study, the next study that I kind of found that talks about this as they continue to grow and get into that adult phase is titled The Effects of Reservoir Characteristics on Crappie Populations in Small Southern Impoundments by a guy named Bryant Haley. This study was actually published, it's brand new. This came out March 1st, 2025.
Nice.
And so what this study, the big takeaway here is that the density or the frequency of largemouth bass exerts a powerful top-down control that structures the crappie population. Okay? Yeah. So the way that they conducted this experiment is, what a lot of these studies do is electrofishing. And they determine what's called a CPE or a catch per effort, or, there's a bunch of different CPUs and things like that, catch per unit effort, And those CPEs, catch per effort, is used as a reliable proxy for the predator density and shows two critical correlations with crappie populations, at least in this study, okay? The first of the two critical correlations is what's called an inverse density association. And what that means is that largemouth bass catch per effort, which really means their, density, is inversely associated with crappie catch per effort. So what that means is that high bass populations exert an effective predation pressure which suppresses the overall crappie density. Now, you might think, well, duh, isn't this obvious? But that's not so obvious, because that is not the case as it relates to other prey species, like different species of shad or even crawfish. This is a unique suppression that is with largemouth bass and fish like crappie and bluegill. So the second of those two critical correlations is what's called a direct quality association, which is where largemouth bass catch per effort is directly associated with crappie growth rate and their condition, okay? So when there is a robust predator population, in our case, largemouth bass, that effectively thins out those crappie, that year class that Sam was talking about, okay? Because those bass are trying to target that first year class because of their size being, only fitting to the size of their mouth.
Yeah.
Those surviving crappie benefit from that, okay? Reduced introspective competition and increases their own per capita resource availability, and which results leads to those faster growth rates like Sam was talking about, and a better overall body condition for those remaining individuals. So, to sum this all up, the presence of a high-quality crappie fishery is often characterized by large crappie, meaning so a high-quality crappie fishing in the context of there being big crappie, not necessarily a lot of crappie, but trophy crappie is a biological indicator of a highly effective predation pressure that is exerted by a robust largemouth bass population. And conversely to that, when crappie populations are numerous but stunted, meaning there's a lot of them, but they're small.
Yeah.
It signifies
10,
a failure.
10 inches.
Correct. It signifies to you a failure of that top-down control mechanism. So okay, that all sounds fancy and all, but what does that really mean? Okay, how do we apply that? If you know that a local lake is well renowned for catching trophy crappie, that is usually and scientifically proven as a great indicator that that lake likely has a pretty robust largemouth bass population. So it's just another way, if you're a guy who's like, hey, should we try this lake? Should we try that lake? Oh, well, this lake is really well known for crappie, but I don't really know if it's, I don't really hear much about bass. Well, if you're hearing great things about big crappie, that's a good indicator that there's a lot of good bass in there. Conversely, if you're fishing at your local pond or your local lake and you are bass fishing, you're catching a bunch of little crappie, that scientifically is an indicator to you that, hey, this lake has been stunted because of the lack of that pyramid structured predation structure, and we might need to find a better place to fish. So, just kind of interesting to know how they affect and overlap. So, the next, I told you at the beginning that I was asking myself, what are the main questions that a listener would want to know? The second one, which is the only one I have left really, is do bass eat crappie, and if so, at what frequencies do they eat crappie compared to other prey? Okay?
Yeah.
Because that's the biggest, that's what we want to know, right? That's what matters. And I highlighted 2 studies here that are really interesting. They kind of have differing results, but still I think there's value to be taken from their results, okay? The first study is titled Food Habitat Analysis of Sublegal Black Bass in Norris Reservoir, Tennessee. This was a master's thesis that was written in the University of Tennessee in Knoxville in 1995, and I've got it pulled up here. This was written by a graduate student, Penny Bennett. Okay, so I'm going to read you just some text from the actual study, and also, as you probably read in the caption of that, sublegal. So these are smaller sized bass. Okay, so just hear that and understand that we understand that what the study is talking about. It's still valuable information. All this is really helps give insight.
Yeah.
So he writes, 805 sublegal black bass, smallmouth bass, and spotted bass, this does all of them, were sampled from the Loyston Sea area of Norris Reservoir, Tennessee from August 1992 to November 1994 to determine their food habits. Approximately 45% of these fish, which was like 358 of them, contained at least one item in their stomach. Food items were analyzed by 3 methods: frequency of occurrence, numerical method, and gravimetric method. The predominant food items were crayfish, 27% by weight, threadfin shad, 24% by weight, and sunfish, 20% by weight, with other items in lesser amounts including minnows, log perch, silver sides, flathead catfish, crappie, and 1 frog. Crayfish were the most important food item for all 3 species of bass in every sample period, except in May of 1993 and May to June in 1994. Fast forwarding a little bit, bluegills and young bass were utilized by largemouth bass, okay, meaning they were eaten by other largemouth bass, during all sample periods except for in August of 1992, with the greatest occurrence in May of 1994. Stomachs of smallmouth bass contained small bass and bluegills in the winter and early spring samples. Spotted bass foraged on sunfish in December of 1993 and November of 1994. This is kind of the big, most important part here. Crappie rarely occurred in their stomachs of any species of black bass and comprised less than 1% of weight, number, and occurrence. which is incredibly interesting. But to me, makes a lot of sense in the context of the growth rate that Sam was talking about when compared to that of bluegill. Okay?
Yeah.
So essentially what the question I was asked, at what frequency compared to other prey, it is less. Okay? And and based off of my understanding of having read this study in the next one I'm going to talk to you about, that has a lot to do with the availability of the right size of that prey. Okay? Not the necessary overall availability of crappie, but rather their size. Yeah. Again, plug for episode 12. Go and listen to that and to hear how the size and shape really of these fish really, really matter.
Yeah.
And then finally, the next part on this, which is the kind of the contrary a little bit, is a article that is titled "Food Habits of Largemouth Bass at Big Creek Lake." This was written by a guy named Von L. Perigmane in 1978. So again, these are older studies at one lake. They're taken over a long period of time, but just take everything with a grain of salt. Go read these for yourself. So this was a test that was done in Iowa. Okay, and again, I'm going to read to you some of this because I think it just makes the most sense to read kind of these results. All right. So largemouth bass food habits were studied for a term of 3 years. Okay, so really long study at this lake in Iowa called the Big Creek Lake. And the objective was to determine the utilization of various food or prey species for food, their food habits, the size at which the bass became piscivorous, and fish food items were, in relation to the bass size and so on. Largemouth bass food habits were studied by examination of their stomach contents of fish captured by electrofishing for that 3-year sample, okay? And what they did is they broke up these largemouth bass that they caught by electrofishing into 4 different size classes, ranging all the way up to fish that were 15 inches and larger.
Mm-hmm.
So the stomach content, I'm skipping down through a bunch of stuff, but the stomach contents of 119 largemouth bass ranging from 200 to 299 millimeters total length. So these are not keepers yet. Yeah. These are just shy of a 15-inch fish. Yeah. Okay. Were examined. 29 of those, of the 119, were void. People are going to hate what I have to say here, but it's the truth. Aquatic insects contributed 768 items, weighing 11.6 grams in the diet of 43 bass. Fish contributed to 208 items, 768 of bugs to 208, the next highest to fish. Just people are underrating bugs again. We're going to become the bug guys. We've taken a lot of flack for that, but it is the truth.
Yeah.
Okay, so fish contributed to 208 items, weighing 118.4 grams, and were found in 62 stomachs. Okay. Bluegill and crappie made up a substantial portion of the diet, with 79 items, weighing 28 grams, in 21 stomachs. Okay, those are the fish that aren't even keepers yet. Okay. They even went on to throw us a bone again and say invertebrates were numerically the most important, contributing to 72% of the food items. Let's move on to those bigger fish, okay? Because that's what matters, right? So now we're talking about keepers. These are 15-inch fish and bigger, okay? And they examined 80 stomachs of these keeper-size bass, all right? 9 of the 80 were empty, okay? And they went on to say that catching these fish they're harder to find. They're less frequent in this lake. 95 fish weighing 581 grams were found in 28 of those bass's stomachs. Okay, bluegill were seen most frequently, and young crappie ranked second. And finally, that unidentifiable fish, which we always tend to think is going to be a shad based off of how they're digested, accounted for 33 items, and crayfish were then at 18 items, and insects were also utilized by larger bass, 41 items weighing 3 grams found in 9 stomachs. So obviously, bugs become less important as the fish get bigger, and switch over to that more piscivorous diet. I know I just read a lot. Let's talk about this a little bit.
Yeah, but no, that's cool that crappie are second in line there.
Now, okay, and I'm going to throw up some graphs here. That is the truth, that crappie do come in that lake as the second most consumed fish by bass that are keepers or bigger, meaning 15 inches or bigger, okay? But do note that in these graphs, which I will put up on in Instagram, they denote in a footnote that when they list those synacrid panfish type fish being the number one consumed, they have a footnote on all of the graphs that say primarily bluegill. So again, that aligns with the study that we saw, that Knoxville study from 1995, that while panfish are frequently consumed by largemouth bass, including those of the larger size, and we talked about in previous episodes as well, bluegill tend to be sought after more frequently than crappie. And knowing what I now know from what Sam has told us about the size and growth rates and competition levels between largemouth bass and crappie, it makes sense to me that a bass is going to eat bluegill more frequently because the more approachable size is more readily available.
Yeah.
A bass is only going to eat what it can fit in its mouth. And if those crappie are growing at a higher rate than juvenile bluegill are, then the window that a crappie is accessible for a bass to eat is much smaller than that of a bluegill. And so, to me, that is why they are targeting those bluegill more. This study, and neither of these studies go into trying to decipher why maybe bluegill more versus crappie, but that's just the results of these studies.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't have a whole lot here left to say other than just trying to think of more practical, what does this mean for our fishing, right?
Yeah.
To me, even though we've talked about the size limitation issue with crappie, there is no doubt that crappie are absolutely considered to be a primary food source for bass. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's this weird dichotomy of juggling, trying to be different, throwing something that people are not throwing hardly at all, versus trying to match something that a bass might eat more frequently. Now, at the end of the day, in my opinion, based off of all the science that we've done through all these episodes, it's going to come down probably more to a size thing at that juncture when you're kind of deciding between those crappie and bluegill baits. But the other thing that I've thought about is color, right? What have we talked about with episode 1, and we've talked about it throughout all these freaking episodes as well, is contrast is king, right?
Yeah.
And we're gonna be we've already talked to Outcast about that, and we're gonna be trying to implement some pretty cool colors we have in mind with trying to highlight contrast, because that's what bass see the most of, not these little subtle tiny differences between one little shade of green and another shade of green,
Yeah.
What do crappie, and we'll obviously post pictures of white and black crappie, but the contrast on those fish can be significantly greater than those of bluegill. And the color profile between a crappie and a bluegill is going to be significantly different as well, because bluegill retain those two colors that bass see really well, oftentimes with an orangish or reddish breastplate, and that greenish back, compared to a crappie that might be more
white and black.
True white and black, I think that comes down to, understanding what is in your lake, understanding if you're going to be fishing around timber. Also, as Sam mentioned, a water clarity, a turbidity thing. Again, we've got an episode on turbidity. How, depending where you're at in the country, saying, hey, you know what? We have crappie in our lake, and the spawn just happened 2 months ago, 4 months ago.
Yeah.
The black crappie are going to be more readily available at this time of year. So let's try to be different. Let's try to
3 to 4 inch size.
Exactly.
Right in that time frame where bass are getting up real shallow. That
Exactly.
doesn't mean pick up a big 7-inch crappie glide bait.
Absolutely.
That means throw a swim bait that's a 3.8-inch Kitech or whatever that looks like a crappie pattern or something like that nobody does. Like nobody does this.
Exactly right. And that's why it's like, you're with all of our stuff, as always, you're juggling all of these different variables and you're weighing, do I want to be different or do I want to match the hat? So that's why, you got to go spend time on the water and experiment with all this, but at least understanding the the complexities between how all these, interact might make you a more informed fisherman. I tend to think that it does.
Yeah, it can just make you be more efficient. And that's everyone's goal on the water, is to just be as efficient as you can. And instead of picking up that, big glide bait, that's a crappie that I have sitting in my boat right now that I pulled out multiple times and swung all day on it trying to catch something, can maybe like, probably not the time. Those crappie are going to be a little smaller that they're probably feeding on at this time.
Yep.
Right. It's just thoughts like that are now going to pop into my head and maybe make me more efficient on the water. That's the whole goal.
Or you start getting out of the spawn, and you go, okay, well, what's going to be the available forage? And you know that, hey, really right around the time that the bluegill spawn is starting, the crappie spawn has already occurred.
Right.
And those fish are already growing. So instead of maybe trying to mess with a bluegill spawn type situation, you can just forget that completely and go to throwing those 2, 3, 4 inch, crappie type stuff that nobody else does. And again, we're not connected with Sixth Sense at all, but I really do think that one of the best crappie imitator lures out there, because there aren't that many, is that panorama. I've caught one of the biggest fish of my life on a crappie panorama in cold water, stacked up, seeing fish stacked up near timber, or during near a submerged tree. So yeah, that's kind of that's what I found to be kind of the most big ticket implications for crappie. So
yeah, it's good stuff.
Anything else you got on this Prey series episode?
No, that's a lot of good stuff on crappie. It's a lot of stuff that I never think of when I'm out there, that it's just going to be in the back of my head now, just helping me make better decisions. And that's why I love to do this. And that's what we're here to try to help you guys with.
Absolutely.
So hope
absolutely.
You guys can take something away from this.
For sure. Well, hey guys, thanks for being patient with us. We're going to try to keep putting stuff out as much as possible. We're doing our best. If you're interested in merch, hit us up, guys. I mean, seriously. And as always, if you got comments on this, you know where to find us. If you got ideas, you guys are always sending stuff our way. Please feel free to send us episodes. We've got a long queue. We've got a lot of material to get through, and so we're not going anywhere anytime soon. So
yeah, we're gonna try to put a store up here in the next probably month or so, and try to figure out what that looks like for us. The way we're probably gonna have to do it is, let you guys order and then close all the orders at once so that we can tell that to our manufacturer, this is how many we need, and ship it, straight from there, potentially to you guys, just to try to be more streamlined, and us trying to figure this out too, like we're so new at this whole podcast merch thing that we're learning too, guys. So, we're just probably going to post a few things on our TikTok, Instagram, stories and stuff like that, just to kind of show you guys a little closer up pictures and see if you guys would want to be interested, and try to open up a shop maybe later in the next couple of weeks or so.
Yeah. And when we talk about support, if you get some merch, what you're doing is you're helping us pay for the software that we're recording on right now, the editing software. We're not trying to make really any money here. Yeah, we're trying to break even, not even, but really, to be honest with you guys, though, we're just excited about it. We really are. We've had so much fun doing this, and so we're just having a good time.
And
I
so if we wearing this out on the boat, people being like, whoa, what's that?
What is that? Yeah. And so if
a podcast about bass fishing,
absolutely. And so it tickles us, the idea of some guy okay, fair, maybe not, it excites us that at the idea of guys wearing our brand out there. So
heck yeah.
All right, we'll end it on that. Thanks for listening, as always, and we will catch you guys next time on episode 14. See you guys
later.